All right, explain to me, though, the difference ideologically between supporting Israel, which is under threat from a totalitarian regime in Iran and through proxies, and Ukraine, which is under threat from a totalitarian regime in Russia. What's the difference?
Today, we're going to take a look at a Piers Morgan clip from a little while ago, but it's still evergreen, I think, where he talks with Tomi Lahren and Francesca Fiorentini and Chris Capilouto as well, but we don't hear as much from him. It's mostly about Tomi Lahren and Francesca Fiorentini talking about the funding of Israel in their conflict with the Palestinians versus funding Ukraine in their conflict with Russia. And I think, especially considering everything that's going on right now, it's worth having a listen to. I'll, of course, be weighing in on these points with my thoughts, although I think, honestly, Francesca Fiorentini does a pretty good job of making the same points that I would make. Anyway, let's get into it.
Well, for one, Israel has a chance of winning their war. They can decimate Hamas. They can put an end to this quickly and decisively if our own president would stop standing in their way. And of course, we've got disgusting, nasty pro-Hamas protesters on our own college campuses, which is a discussion for another day. But Israel can win this. Israel can wipe out Hamas and Islamic terrorism. We haven't seen Ukraine be able to hold off Russia. So there's the first difference here. And also, as I mentioned previously, Israel has a track record of being able to audit itself, being able to be responsible with money that it's being given.
Really?
I don't know if we can say the same thing about Ukraine. I don't think anyone would believe that Ukraine, which has a long history of corruption, Piers, as you know.
Okay, I have one question for you. Which of these two leaders is currently involved directly in a corruption trial alleging fraud, bribery and breach of trust? Is it President Zelensky, or is it Prime Minister Netanyahu?
Zing.
Well, the people of Israel will have to decide on the Netanyahu issue, and they will decide that. But Ukraine as a country goes far beyond just Zelensky. Ukraine itself has a long history of corruption. So it's not about just one guy and one election that can easily maybe solve some of those problems. This is about a nation that has a history of corruption. So a lot of Americans are unsettled about sending so much money. And also, I would also point this out. It's not just military aid. It's also economic aid. The fact that the American people are funding economic aid for government bureaucrats in Ukraine, I'm sorry, Piers, that's a bridge too far for me.
Okay. Francesca, your response.
Yeah, I think both of your framing is bogus. I don't think that Israel is fighting against a totalitarian regime in Iran, and I don't think they're waging a war. They are waging a one-sided ethnic cleansing against the people of Gaza, 34,000 of whom have been killed already, and 25,000 of those people are women and children. There was just a mass grave discovered under a hospital in the city of Khan Yunis where surgeons in scrubs were found handcuffed before they were summarily killed. So I think both of your framing is off here. If anything, if you're going to talk about the ways that Ukraine actually mirrors Israel, it's that the people of Palestine are the Ukrainians, and their own sovereignty has been taken from them by Israel, and in the case of Ukraine, by Russia. Look, broken clock situation here with Tomi Lahren, because honestly, we disagree about pretty much everything. But I think it is true that we need to see some sort of light at the end of the tunnel when it comes to funding endless war. You know, Tommy, you said diplomacy. Man, if only we had diplomacy in this situation in both Israel and in Russia. But no one's actually talking about true diplomatic solutions. So Representative Ilhan Omar has said that she would like checks on the amount of weapons that are sent over to Ukraine to see if there is, what has been the result of that? Can we talk about diplomatic solutions? As a progressive, as someone who does not want to see more war and more death, I believe in that too. What's funny about Republicans in this case, though, is they never met a war they didn't like. They don't apply this to Israel. They don't apply this to anywhere else in the world. They love war. They got us into Iraq. They got us into Afghanistan. They got us into, some drone wars in Pakistan. And now they want to send troops down to the southern border so they can prevent a Salvadoran woman from coming into this country and setting up the best lunch spot in their town.
Hey, man, girl, go get her.
Pusas are delicious. And that's where they're like, oh, they love wars. So why is it that this is the one war that Republicans don't like? Does it have anything to do with the fact that in the year 2016, Donald Trump actually changed the RNC platform, the Republican platform then? And the one thing he changed was what? We will not defend Ukraine if Russia gets involved. Very curious.
Okay, well, let's bring in the military expert, Chris Capilouto. Chris, it is strange to me, looking from outside, that the Republican Party is so split on this. Normally, if you had a case of a Russian dictator illegally invading a sovereign democratic country in Europe, then every Republican I know historically would have been absolutely in favour of helping that European country repel the Russian invaders. And yet the Republicans are split. There are some who share Tommy's views about this. There are others like Lindsey Graham, absolutely emphatic the other way. There are people like Marjorie Taylor Greene, who've been dubbed Moscow Marjorie for her slavish support of Putin's rhetoric, even down to just spreading utter nonsense that they're run by Nazis. In fact, there's never been an election in Ukraine where more than 3% of far right have voted. You've never had, as she claims, that it's a war on Christianity. In fact, it's the Russians who are killing a lot of Christian leaders in Ukraine, not the Ukrainians, and so on. So it's very strange to me to see the party so divided on this. But from a military strategy point of view, what is the rationale, do you think, for America supporting Ukraine? And why would it differ in any way from supporting either Israel or Taiwan?
Thank you, Piers. Yeah, I think it's the Republicans have concerns about sending $95 billion in foreign aid to countries like Ukraine, and in this case in Ukraine. And I can understand that concern, because you don't want to see the money go, and like Tammy just brought up, you don't want that money to be wasted, especially if you think that there's no possibility of Ukraine potentially winning. But when you look at, from a military point of view, from a military strategy point of view, you look at the actual aid bill, you see the type of capabilities that we're planning to send to Ukraine. Like, the first thing on the aid bill that you see is the long-range ATACMS. The ATACMS missile, the previous version that we sent to Ukraine, had a top max range of about 165 kilometers. This new missile is going to have a 300-kilometer max range, which will put additional pressure on the Russian front lines. They'll be able to strike their command outposts deeper behind the front lines. So I do think that this aid will increase the likelihood that Ukraine could be victorious. So yes, I understand the Republicans' hesitancy to send money there, especially when Ukraine in the past has had issues with corruption, and you don't want to see that money be wasted or spent in a bad way there. But when you look at the bill, what happens is you see that there's additional funding for oversight in that bill. So I think there's less of a concern for that. I think that the main thing that's missing in Ukraine right now is that they don't have the artillery shells that they need. They don't have the air defense capabilities that they need, because right now we're seeing Ukraine is being pushed back. That is factual. They just lost a city in Avdiivka. But the reason that's happening is because Russia is able to push their fighter jets closer to the front lines. They're able to drop glide bombs, 500-kilogram bombs that leave giant craters, that they're firing at 100 of these munitions a day. So if they had air defense munitions and the Patriot batteries, if that was sent to Ukraine today, that wouldn't be happening. And the evidence that I would provide for that is if you look at the last 2 years of aid that we sent, we saw it was working. In 2022, the Ukrainians pushed forward in their counteroffensive. They gained land. They weren't losing territory until Coincidentally, they just started losing territory in the last 6 months. I think that that's happening because the aid dried up. So the Pentagon, they're smart. They have stockpiles right now in Germany of all these different munitions that are just waiting for the green light to be sent into Ukraine. The aid would get there quickly. I do think it would have an impact on the ground. Now, to your point, Piers, about why aren't we supporting a country that is under attack from authoritarian governments? Yeah. Something that I think that is interesting from a military strategy point of view. Recently, if you look at China, North Korea, and Iran, they don't have any qualms with supporting Russia. You look at North Korea. They just spent 3 million artillery shells they shipped on 6,000 containers over to Russia to help support Russia's war efforts. When you look at Iran, they sent thousands of drones, 300,000 artillery shells. This is billions in aid that Iran and North Korea have sent, and China as well. China might as well be sending a foreign aid bill of their own because they're buying cheap Russian oil and they're supporting the war effort that way. And they're also more recently upping their ante. They're sending machine tooling parts. They're sending missile components that they could use for cruise missiles in Russia. So Russia, Iran, and North Korea are adversaries, authoritarian governments. They believe that it's worth investing in Russia. They believe that the outcome of the war in Ukraine is important enough to invest all of that billions of aid into. So I am surprised that the Republicans aren't moving faster on the bill, but they are moving on it. You just saw Mike Johnson. He just switched to now.
Well, he did, but interestingly, Donald Trump actually,
from his point of view, he said it was because he got an intelligence report that made him change his mind.
Yeah.
So I'd be curious to know what was in that report.
Yeah, well, he made it clear that he read the reports, believed them, and thinks that if anyone thinks that Putin will stop with Ukraine, they're living in cloud cuckoo land, which brings me back to you, Tommy. Why are you living in cloud cuckoo land about Vladimir Putin? Why do you not think that if he was to prevail in Ukraine to actually beat a sovereign democratic European country, he wouldn't just march into another one?
Man, that is the $64,000 question.
He's a ruthless Russian dictator. And since when did Republicans suck up to ruthless Russian dictators and say, go on, help yourself to sovereign democratic countries? I thought you were the absolute epitome of saving freedom and democracy, weren't you?
Well, I'll tell you this, there are a lot of neocons in my party who love war, and they love the military-industrial complex, and they would love to continue wars all around the world because it lines their pockets. I'm talking about people like Dick Cheney and Nikki Haley. Dick Cheney and Nikki Haley are not America First conservatives like was birthed during the Make America Great Again movement, where we said we are done with endless wars. We are done with going in and meddling in other nations and then spending more money to rebuild those nations. And a lot of us have had enough of it because we've seen that the fruits of that have not proven anything positive for the American people or our way of life. But I'll also say this. There's a lot of talk about should we help Ukraine? Should we not help Ukraine? Like I said before, Piers, let's make it alone. Ukraine is a mineral-rich, natural resources-rich territory. They should be able to repay us. If indeed they are able to take our generous handouts, they should be able to repay us. So I don't understand why that can't be put on the table and why there's such heavy pushback for them to repay us if they do in fact beat Russia with our help.
Right, but are you comfortable for Vladimir Putin to win? Do you think that's in America's national interest, given what you've just heard from a military expert about the axis of evil? Quite clearly, Iran, North Korea, China, all invested in Russia prevailing here. Why would that not send massive alarm bells to you about what's going on in the geopolitical part of this?
It certainly does. But again, if Ukraine can win this war without American boots on the ground, that would be great. They haven't given us the indication that they are able to do that. And how many years is this going to drag on? How much more U.S. funding is going to drag on? And also, why isn't Europe chipping in a little bit more? I'm sorry, Piers, but you'd think maybe the U.S. didn't have to be the babysitter for the world. I'd also say in regards to Russia.
I would say the UK has, but other countries have been lagging. And you're right. I've always agreed with Donald Trump, by the way, about NATO countries not pulling their weight financially. It shouldn't be left to America to always be the ones who do pay their dues when others don't. So I completely agree about that point of it. But I just find it staggering that anyone in America would genuinely think that letting Putin win would be good for America, because it wouldn't be. It would embolden one of your great historical enemies. Let's bring in Francesca here on that, because you're nodding.
I would just say it's an awkward position for Tommy to be in, because the reality is that there's total hypocrisy here, that this is the one war that Republicans are like, oh, our God King Emperor told us we don't like this war, and so we have to figure out a way to not like this war, but like all the other wars, which is Donald Trump. And here's Donald Trump's worldview. I think Tomi is tapping into something very real in the Republican Party, which is a sense of isolationism, right? They're like, we don't want wars abroad. We want wars here on our own people, like black people, brown people, and the southern border. We love those kinds of wars.
Hang on.
Before I let him get a word in edgewise, I mean, that's a sensational thing to say. But isolationism and, authoritarianism in particular does require internal division to stay in power, right? A democracy requires trust. A dictatorship requires terror. And what I mean by that is we need to focus on, quote, the enemy within, right? In our current case, in this recent election, it's the migrants crossing the border, and even more disturbingly, it's those radical left-wing liberals in our own government. So not even, quote, illegal aliens who are murderers and rapists streaming across our borders to literally murder our American way of life, but those Americans who aren't quite American enough, or not American in the right way, right? And this is just the canary in the coal mine of. So what we're going to start doing is we're going to pick the obvious other easy targets, and we're going to deport them or get rid of them, and then authoritarianism needs to look for another other and deals with them, and then it looks for another other. And it turns a blind eye to isolationism, turns a blind eye to anything going on in the rest of the world. But we're not living, in 1815 here. We're living in 2024. Everything's connected. Global markets are connected. What happens in Russia absolutely affects what happens here in the United States, whether day-to-day citizens feel it immediately or not. I tell you, if Putin escalates to nuclear conflict in Ukraine, as he is currently threatening to do, we're going to feel it pretty fast.
No, wait, let me finish.
Hang on.
Let me finish.
Hang on. Let me just, on that point, no, I can't let you say that without challenging that. She never said anything like that. And the truth is about the southern border, it's not the cozy little picture that you paint of some poor woman and their baby, being stopped from coming in and having lunch. The situation of the southern border, whether you're on the left or the right, or any political side in America, is an absolute disaster that everybody knows is an absolute disaster. So to categorize it as racism, I think is completely wrong.
Oh, they don't call it racist. It just happens to be Latinos and black people that get the boots on their necks. But when it comes to law and order on our God Emperor, who's currently in his first criminal trial right now, that's fine. He can flaunt whatever laws he wants. The thing is this. I don't believe that we need to support those endless wars. I think Tomi's absolutely correct. And I think the base of both the Democratic and the Republican parties, the left, the right, whatever you want to call it, are sick and tired. Because as Piers, you aptly laid out, there's never a question of where the money's going to come from when it comes to war. But whenever we want anything like, I don't know, money for education or paid family leave or reining in, climate chaos, then it's like, oh my goodness. And it's usually Republicans who are like, trillions of dollars of debt. But if Donald Trump is reelected, he's going to extend that debt by extending the tax breaks that he gave to his billionaire friends. And that added almost $2 trillion to our deficit. But no one's asking how we're going to pay for that. So I'm pointing out the hypocrisy on the left and the right. Leading Democrats are full of it when it comes to endless war, and I'm the first to call that out. Again, we need an actual diplomatic solution. Yes, Putin is an unstable actor, but there has to be a way forward that isn't just more war. I agree with you. We don't want him to win, but also how can we actually move this forward that doesn't involve simply funneling more money?
I'm going to stop there. I really agree with Francesca Fiorentini. There's a lot of good points here. I want to hear from you. Are you a Piers Morgan person? Are you more of a Francesca Fiorentini advocate, or even a Tomi Lahren? If you're a Tomi Lahren supporter, I'm not sure what you're doing here, but I will admit that Tomi Lahren makes a couple of interesting points in the what about salad, the isolation. First of all, I'll go on the record and say I think that isolationism didn't work the first time around in America, and it's not going to work this time around. And I mean, history has proven that it's not a winning strategy. I think that's an absolute recipe for disaster. Chime in the comments. Let me know what you think. Who made good points? What are we glossing over here? And I can't wait to see what you've got to say.